Hey guys, this is Mr. V over here doing a book review today for John Adams by David McCullough. Before I get into my book review, I just hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different types of book reviews, so I always hope you guys come back and watch different book reviews. But anyway, let's get into my book review today for John Adams by David McCullough. So this book is a very interesting book and a very fun book. It is basically a biography about John Adams, who was one of the founding fathers and the second president of the United States. And it's a very good book because I feel John Adams was a very overlooked president, and he was a very underrated person. He's a very overlooked founding father, but he was an overlooked president because he was a second president who, right after George Washington and right before Thomas Jefferson, both very well-known figures. And that's why I think he's overlooked a lot. And that's what made this book very interesting, is you got to learn about who John Adams was. And that's why I say it's a fun book. So this book, basically, it starts in 1776. McCullough just starts you in 1776 during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the start of the American Revolution. But then he goes into Adams' family history and basically his upbringing and his early life in the 1750s. But he quickly brings it back to the 1770s. He does cover some of the big events that happened between the 1750s to the 1770s, which is really good. While he does it fairly brief, it's good that he does cover those events, because then you don't need to know your history too well. I think it helps knowing history, but you don't need to know the history because he gives you the relevant events, such as what happened, like the Stamp Act or the Boston Massacre, the different Congress meetings, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He goes in depth about all those. While brief, he still does do a good job of telling you about those events, so that you don't need to know history. Again, I think it helps knowing history, but it's not a necessity. So, that's always a good thing when reading different history books. And then he goes into the American Revolution and what John Adams did during the American Revolution. And basically, John Adams during the American Revolution, he went to France, and he did many things, like signed many treaties over there while he was in France during the Revolution. And it was fun hearing about John Adams during his time in France. Not only signing some of those treaties and what he did in France, but also hearing some of the other interesting events. And there's many interesting events that I'm not going to talk about here, but even how he found out who different British spies were, or things like that. So it's a lot of fun reading about it. And he not only covered John Adams, but he even covered John Adams' family and what they did during the Revolution, and how his son came with him to France, and what his wife thought about it, and what the Adams family, and just in general, what their time was like in France as well. So it was definitely very fun, and you got to see what John Adams did. And basically, John Adams was overseas for the entire revolution, for the entire American Revolution. So you only get the perspective of the overseas. So I'll comment on that in a bit, but just be aware you only get the overseas perspective if you read this book. But again, I'll cover that in a bit. But it was cool also then, McCullough then went on with Adams' life and what it was like when John Adams came back to America in 1787, 1788 time. And it was cool how McCullough covered it, and the big events that had happened and the big changes that had happened that we don't even think of. And McCullough pointed out a few of those, like how many things had changed, like how many people had died who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and how many people who Adams knew had died because of the American Revolution, and how many new people were in government at that point, or in the government at that point. People, big-time people like Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, and how these new people did not trust Adams. How they didn't have much trust or much respect for Adams because he was overseas. They didn't really know who he was, and these are things that you don't think about, but McCullough writes about. And that's also what makes this a very interesting book, and it's very fun because another thing is that he even covers the way the states thought when Adams had returned, as how the different states didn't want to unite. When Adams left, he left and they were all united, and basically they just united to win the war. But then when he comes back, it was they didn't want to unite, and they even had different currencies, and just some of the things that Adams saw. So there was things like that McCullough covers. That was a lot of fun. And Then he goes in depth about John Adams' vice presidency, but then also his presidency, which was very interesting because I thought Adams had a very interesting presidency with a very interesting election. There was a very crazy election and pretty nasty. Like we see the presidential elections of today, and they did some of the same tricks back then, and it was pretty nasty, some of the tricks they did, and it's very interesting reading what the different people did in those days, and even what John Adams did in those days too. So it's just fun reading about it, but it's also fun seeing like after he gets elected, what happens during his presidency. And there are so many first time situations. This was still like the founding of the country. You know, even though he was the second president, there were so many things that they didn't know what to do yet. One of the biggest things is like who had greater power. And just a few examples. One of them, as I said, was who had greater power, the Supreme Court or the president. And, you know, those are some of the things that McCullough goes in depth about, and because that happened during his presidency, or what happens if there's a tie in elections, and, you know, things like that. They didn't know what to do yet. Nothing was set in stone. So McCullough goes in depth about what John Adams did, but also what Congress did. And again, it's just very, very interesting. And it's cool that he also follows basically John Adams after his presidency, and basically until John Adams' death. John Adams lived a very long life, but he follows him for all those years after his presidency. And he not only follows Adams, but he follows his wife, his son, and even some of the main figures in Adams' life, like Thomas Jefferson, and, you know, like his communications with them, what had happened to them. And so you get to hear like what happens to a lot of the people around John Adams. And, you know, I thought McCullough did a great job with that. So, you know, that was a great part. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book. I felt this book had a slower start. And this is one of those things that's kind of tough because you kind of need to want to stick with it. I'm assuming if you pick up this book, you want to learn about John Adams, but you really kind of have to want to learn about history and want to stick with it. And it does become more interesting pretty quickly, but it still takes a little bit of time because, again, it is a slower start. So you want to be aware of that. And another thing was that this book had very long chapters. While there were subsections in between, there were still long chapters. So that was somewhat tough because if you're reading it, it's hard to read and then put down the book and come back to it later. But there were just very long chapters. So, you know, that made it tough at points. Now, some of the things I really didn't like about the book, though, is that I felt McCullough really downplayed George Washington's role in 1776. Because he does talk about Jefferson, he does talk about Franklin, he talks about many others. But I felt he really downplayed George Washington, and I felt he didn't really give much credit to George Washington. I don't know the reason for that. The only reason I could think of is that George Washington fought in America and he fought on land, where John Adams was overseas the whole time. So maybe that's why he downplayed George Washington, but George Washington still had a big role in Congress. So I felt that McCullough I felt he didn't do a really good job in those regards. You still learn about Adams, of course, but I felt that he should have given more credit to Washington. And another thing was that he didn't go too far in depth about the American Revolution. Now, he talked about what happens where Adams was. Adams was in France and he was in the Netherlands, and he goes in depth about what Adams did, and, you know, that was really good. But he doesn't go in depth about the American Revolution, which I felt can kind of hurt the books at points, because he didn't write what happened in America between 1776 and 1783, yet a lot had happened. While Adams was working on the treaties, a lot happened in America. So if you did not know much about history, you know, you would think that the American Revolution, you know, wasn't that difficult, because he brought an end to the American Revolution pretty quickly. And that's why you would think it wasn't that difficult, because he covered it so quickly. And if you did not know that, like, America was close to losing many battles, they were close to losing the whole war so many times, and McCullough didn't really cover that aspect. So that's another thing that I thought he didn't do too well for this book. You know, again, he still covers John Adams very well. So I guess that's not absolutely needed, but I think for covering like the amount he was doing overseas, I think you should know more about the American Revolution, that he should have covered that a little more in depth. But, you know, those are just some of the things I thought he could have done better. Now, as for McCullough's writing style, I thought this was a very well-written book, because McCullough uses different sources. He uses John Adams' journals, he uses letters he's written, he uses newspaper clippings and many other sources to know what is going on, what's in their mind, communications, everything like that. yet it is still very easy to read and very easy to understand. It's not a difficult book at all. So that's where I thought he just did a great job writing this book, because this book does not bore at all. It does not feel like a history book. And that's always a great thing, is when it doesn't feel like a history book, because then it makes you want to keep reading it and you want to learn more. So that's always a great aspect. And because of that, I felt this was a very fun book overall. Overall, I thought this was a very fun book. And I feel it's a fun book of a very overlooked person and a very underrated president. And I think that, I would definitely recommend this for people who want to learn more about the founding fathers, or want to learn more about the starting of the United States and the founding of all that and what had happened. And just a quick note, I would say this would be a great book to read after 1776, which was also written by David McCullough. But I definitely recommend it if you want to learn about different founding fathers and the starting of America. But if you have any questions or comments, please post that in the comment section below. Again, I hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I upload multiple different types of book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.